Hello, welcome to FHE on the Road with Christine Stevenson. This podcast is designed to connect the people and the places from the past with your lives today, with 5-minute stories and facts from church history. Save these stories for when you are traveling through these areas to bring history to life. Okay, welcome back to FHE on the Road with Christine. Today we're going to talk about Brigham Young entering the Salt Lake Valley, and I think it's pretty amazing. I love the history of the Latter-day Saints. I love how you can see so clearly God's hand directing and guiding them. I was reading this book called 40 Years, The Saga of Building the Salt Lake Temple by Mark Henshaw, and he goes into so much detail about why the Salt Lake Temple took 40 years to build. And he goes over every single bit of it. And I've read it through a couple times, and now I'm trying to pull out some stories from it. And it's just packed with so much information. So if you're interested in these stories at all, go read his book. It's so good. I just pulled this story out right out of the book and I'll reference it. So yeah, let's get going. So Brigham Young was the second prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and this story happened before he was ordained as prophet. So he was the senior member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Brigham Young was a visionary man directed by our Heavenly Father. The death of the first prophet, Joseph Smith, came as such a shock to the church, and especially to Brigham Young. Brigham knew that critical decisions had to be made quickly right after the death of Joseph, and with the mob who killed Joseph still around and still pestering the saints and coming after them, Brigham knew that action needed to be taken to get out of Nauvoo. Brigham needed the help of his Heavenly Father to make these decisions correctly and have the confidence that he was doing it the way Heavenly Father would have him do. One of the ways the Lord communicated with Brigham was through dreams and visions. This gave Brigham a firm understanding of his mission on earth and was able to see exactly what needed to be done. One of the most important visions, in my opinion, given to Brigham from our Heavenly Father was the location of where the saints should settle in the West. The Latter-day Saints were in shock after the death of the prophet Joseph Smith, and even in mourning, the Latter-day Saints continued to work on the Nauvoo temple. The persecutors against the church did not let up, even after they killed Joseph. The saints didn't want to give up their temple that they had put so much work into, and they desired to make those covenants before leaving Nauvoo. They pulled together and worked hard, even through the violence. Brigham Young said it was, quote, by the aid of the sword in one hand and the trowel and the hammer in the other, with firearms at hand and a strong band of police, and the blessings of heaven, that the saints, through hunger and thirst and weariness and watching and praying, so far completed the temple, despite the devices of the mob. End of quote. They finished the Nauvoo temple on May 1st, 1846, almost 2 years after the prophet Joseph Smith was killed in Carthage jail, many leaving before the temple was dedicated. In 1842, Joseph Smith had predicted the saints would settle in the Rocky Mountains, saying, quote, I prophesied that the saints would continue to suffer much affliction and would be driven to the Rocky Mountains. Many would apostatize, others would be put to death by our persecutors or lose their lives in consequence or exposure or disease. And some of you will live to go and assist in making settlements and build cities and see the saints become a mighty people in the midst of the Rocky Mountains. End of quote. So that revelation was given by Joseph Smith in 1842, and they finished the Nauvoo temple in 1846. So Joseph Smith died in 1844. So 2 years before he died is when he gave that revelation. So the saints knew, Brigham Young knew that they were going to go to the Rocky Mountains, but he didn't know where in the Rocky Mountains that he was supposed to settle. And where and when the saints were supposed to make it to the Rocky Mountains, the logistics of getting the people to the West, and how exactly the Lord wanted them to settle were questions Brigham took to the Lord. Brigham made the questions a matter of fervent fasting and prayer. The answers came from the Lord to Brigham in a vision one night. In the vision, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young's dear friend and first prophet of the church, he came and showed Brigham where the saints should settle in the West in a vision or a dream at night. Joseph showed Brigham a flag on a hill and said, quote, build under the point where the colors fall and you will prosper and have peace. End of quote. Through this vision or dream, Brigham's fervent prayers had been answered and he knew where to go. Brigham knew this hill was in the Great Salt Lake area. He had his sights set on the Salt Lake Valley. At the time, the Salt Lake Valley was part of the Mexican territory Alta Upper California. The Latter-day Saints had been making preparations to leave Nauvoo and never return. A negotiation was made between the Latter-day Saints and the leadership of their tormentors, or mob of men, for the Latter-day Saints to be left alone until May of 1846. And similar to the persecutions in Missouri, again, the negotiations did not work, and violence arose outside of the city of Nauvoo, and the Saints were not permitted to wait until May of 1846. The Latter-day Saints were pushed out of their beautiful town by these horrible people seeking their homes and provisions. Many of the saints, including Brigham and his company, left in February of 1846 to head west across to Iowa, and that was even before the Nauvoo Temple was completed and dedicated. So they left in 1846. Brigham left in February of 1846. One of the many blessings the saints saw as they were leaving Nauvoo was the temperatures of Nauvoo dropped below zero, freezing the Mississippi River solid in February of 1846. The river freezing over allowed the wagons of the Latter-day Saints to be driven across the frozen river. It was also a blessing for those without wagons to be able to walk across the river instead of needing to be ferried to the other side. The departure from Nauvoo was an emotional one for many Latter-day Saints. Being pushed out of the city they loved, the saints left behind friends, the body of the prophet who had recently been killed. It was heartbreaking for them to leave. It was also nerve-wracking to look into the future of this unknown land. The Lord helped the saints continue to put one step in front of the other into unknown territories with the assurance that, quote, all will be well. A friend of the Latter-day Saints described their departure saying, quote, the people of Iowa told me that from morning till night they passed westward like an endless procession. They did not seem greatly out of heart, they said, but at the top of every hill before they disappeared were to be seen looking back like banished Moors on their homes and the far-seen temple and its glittering spire. End of quote. 1846 was an extremely wet year. It was with great difficulties that the saints traveled by wagon away from Nauvoo. The cold, wet weather would not let up, and getting the saints from Nauvoo to where they settled for that year in winter quarters took 131 days, or 4 months. The others, more prepared groups, it took them 111 days. There were 700 people who died on the trek to winter quarters from Nauvoo. The town of Winter Quarters was established in Nebraska to help the saints prepare to get to the Salt Lake Valley. Winter Quarters was rough. It was still so hard. The first winter in Winter Quarters was very difficult for the saints. The temperature on January 18th, 1847 dropped to 20 degrees below zero. It was very cold and very wet, and so many challenges even before they started on to the Great Salt Lake. Brigham was very stressed with what was occurring, and by January, Brigham had lost so much weight from the stress that his clothes didn't fit anymore. That would be a lot on Brigham. Brigham was determined to get the saints to the valley and planned to leave as soon as possible. The snow was still falling and the rivers had not thawed and they were still low on supplies, so Brigham's company did not leave Winter Quarters until April 9th. But Brigham's company didn't make it far, only to Elkhorn River, before Brigham was called back to Winter Quarters to address the church one more time before they reached Salt Lake. So it really wasn't until April 14th, 1847, that Brigham finally left Winter Quarters to start the long trek to Salt Lake. The Latter-day Saints had been listening to reports from explorers who had mapped out the Salt Lake Valley. Explorers like Jim Bridger and John C. Fremont published information saying the valley was no good for farming. They reported that the valley had been a barren place with few trees and little useful vegetation of any kind. One explorer named Goodyear met the company while he was heading back east. He told them that he, quote, had tried to experiment in sowing grain and vegetables in a small way, but he too was unable to give any hope. He told of hard frosts, cold climate, difficult to produce grain and vegetables in any of the mountain regions. End of quote. So that would have been discouraging for the saints. When Brigham was 116 miles away from the Salt Lake Valley, he contracted a terrible sickness that they called, quote, mountain fever. End of quote. So they weren't quite sure what it was, and it was on April 12th, 1847. Brigham called on Elder Orson Pratt to take the group of 42 men and push ahead the final 116 miles, being the first of the Latter-day Saints to enter the Salt Lake Valley. Brigham was looking to get his first company to the valley and set up the area for all the saints to come and settle in the area. So he took some of the most hardworking and diligent saints with him to work so hard when they got there. I'm so impressed with what what they were able to do and how quick they were able to farm the land. It's so impressive. I love hearing these stories, and I will speak more about that later. This group needed to get there quickly to prepare the land, plant the crops, and help the next ones that were coming. It was only Brigham and the other sick travelers that were straggling behind as Orson Pratt's group tried to break ground and start planting crops on the 23rd of July, 1847. Wilford Woodruff was driving the wagon carrying the incredibly sick Brigham Young. Wilford drove the wagon until they reached Big Mountain. It was there when both men saw the Great Salt Lake Valley for the very first time. These men did not see the same things that they had been warned about by the trappers. These two men saw potential in the Great Salt Lake Valley. This valley was a gift of our Heavenly Father to his saints. Wilford Woodruff said this. He said, quote, "We gazed in wonder and admiration upon the vast valley before us, with the waters of the Great Salt Lake glistening in the sun, the mountains towering in the sky, and streams of pure water running through the beautiful valley. It was the grandest scene we had ever beheld till this moment. Pleasant thoughts ran through our minds at the prospect that not many years hence a house of God would be established on the mountains and exalted above the hills, while the valley would be converted into orchards, vineyards, fruitful fields, cities erected in the name of the Lord, and the standard of Zion unfurled for the gathering of all nations." End of quote. So that's what Wilford Woodruff said when he first saw the valley. And Brigham Young, who was incredibly ill in the wagon, was also moved by the sight. Brigham later said, "I ascended and crossed over Big Mountain. When on its summit, I directed Elder Woodruff, who had kindly tendered me to the use of his carriage, to turn some halfway around so I could have a view of the portion of the Salt Lake Valley. The spirit of light rested upon me and hovered over the valley, and I felt that there the saints would find protection and safety." End of quote. According to the records of Wilford Woodruff, Brigham's actual words were less eloquent. Brigham pushed himself up with some effort, being so incredibly ill. Supporting himself on his arm, he looked out to the valley opened before him for several long minutes, and he said, quote, "It is enough. This is the right place." Wilford recalled him saying, "Drive on," and then he laid back in the wagon. Poor Brigham. Can you believe that Heavenly Father had given him this great vision, and he knew that this was the place that thousands and thousands of Latter-day Saints would be able to find safety and peace in this mountain land, but Brigham was the leader and so incredibly ill that he was just barely able to rise up and say, yeah, this is the place. Both Wilford Woodruff and Brigham entered the Great Salt Lake Valley together. These two men would be pivotal in the construction of the Salt Lake Temple. Brigham spent a large portion of his life preparing and building the Salt Lake Temple, and Wilford Woodruff, working along with Brigham, would be the prophet at the completion of the temple. Both men instruments in the hands of God in bringing the Salt Lake Temple to life. I thought that hearing how Brigham and Wilford came into the valley was so amazing. I love that our Heavenly Father directed these prophets on the place where the saints could find peace and be able to flourish in the desert, or make the desert flourish like a rose. And I'm so grateful that Heavenly Father reserved this place that no one wanted, and that our Heavenly Father gave this to the saints so that they could find peace and grow. And anyways, I thought that this story was pretty cool. Hopefully you like it too. Thanks. Thank you for listening to FHE on the road today. We hope you enjoyed what you've heard. Please like, subscribe, and share with anyone who'd be interested in these stories. Thanks.